Hello, are we on, folks?
I can hear you, Dan. This is Kevin.
Great, thank you. Sorry, we had a few technical problems, but we're ready to get started. So thanks everyone for their patience. Welcome to the Just Wage Forum 2021. My name is Dan Graff. I'm a US labor historian at the University of Notre Dame, where I also direct the interdisciplinary Higgins Labor Program at our Center for Social Concerns. Named for Catholic priest, labor economist, and worker advocate Monsignor George Higgins, the Higgins Labor Program explores questions about work, the politics of work, and the work of social justice through the lens of Catholic social teaching, which emphasizes such principles as the dignity of work, the right of everyone not only to decent work, but to also a voice at the workplace, solidarity with the marginalized, and a commitment to the common good. The major research initiative of the Higgins Labor Program is our Just Wage Initiative, which probes the foundational question rooted in Catholic social tradition. What makes any given wage just or unjust? And the major fruit of that research from the past few years is our new Just Wage Framework, an online tool, a resource for professors, policymakers, and practitioners, from employers to union activists to parish and community groups, to engage just wage questions and come away committed to contributing to promoting a fairer, more inclusive, more sustainable, indeed, a more just economy. The Just Wage Forum that we're kicking off today will introduce you to our Just Wage Framework of 7 interrelated criteria. And over the next several months, we've invited a great group of experts drawn from the scholarly and practitioner realms to share their own research and perspectives. After today, each session will focus on one of the 7 just wage criteria, and each will feature one scholar researcher and one practitioner activist, followed by comments by a member of our own Just Wage working group. I'm trying to share my screen here, so bear with me. Because I'm a little bit slow, can somebody tell me whether they can see the Just Wage Forum criteria in one slide?
Yes, we can see that.
Wonderful, thank you. We've already announced the February 26th event that you see posted here, A Just Wage Fosters a Decent Life. We're looking forward to that. But here's a less pretty snapshot of the 2 sessions following that, if you'd like to mark your calendar, March 19th and April 9th. We've just finalized the March and April dates this week, and we'll be making them public next week. Today, myself and 2 colleagues from our Just Wage working group, faculty members in history, social ethics, and management, just to give you an idea of the interdisciplinary breadth of our collaboration, we'll briefly introduce our Just Wage framework, and then we'll hear a response from Don Stabile, professor of economics at St. Mary's College of Maryland. We'll conclude with a discussion featuring questions from the webinar's attendees. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks too to my colleagues in the Just Wage Working Group and at the Center for Social Concerns more broadly, especially our acting executive director, Bill Purcell, for all his support, our communications team, for all their active efforts regarding promotion and technology. Our current student workers, Stasia Reisinger, and past ones, too many to name here, some of whom are on this webinar today, and Judy Benchar, the Higgins Labor Program's administrative assistant. As we turn to the content of today's session, I should say a note about protocol and participation. This Just Wage Forum, initially designed as an intimate weekend gathering of folks on the campus of Notre Dame in March of 2020, was postponed due to the pandemic. And we've now reimagined it as a virtual forum spread out over several months. Because it's online, we're able to include many, many more people. And we're gratified that so many are able to participate virtually today. But we still aim to reach for that personal connection that only face-to-face collaboration can truly foster. And so to approximate that, we've invited those with speaking roles at any of the upcoming Just Wage Forum sessions to join in the conversation after today's presentations, when those folks can turn on their cameras, raise questions, and contribute to the discussion. For other attendees, we ask that you use the Q&A function to raise questions and comments throughout the presentations and afterward. We'll do our best to prioritize and address as many of those questions as we can in the 75 minutes we have. And for those we don't get to, we can always follow up outside the session via email and the like. Now, let's turn to a brief introduction of the Just Wage framework and online tool, where it comes from, what it does and why it matters. To answer that first question, the Just Wage Framework's origin story, I'll turn now to Clemens Sedmak, Professor of Social Ethics at Notre Dame's Kiel School for Global Affairs, and advisor in Catholic social tradition at the Center for Social Concerns. Clemens.
Thank you, Dan. Good afternoon to you all. So where does the Just Wage Framework come from? The idea of this framework was developed here at the Center for Social Concerns, a center committed to enacting and applying Catholic social teaching. Catholic social teaching, as most of you know, is a body of texts, especially papal encyclicals, not all of which are exciting to read, but still deep and thoughtful. The first social encyclical was published in 1891 by Pope Leo XIII. He reflected on the condition of workers, many of whom were suffering in the new world of industrialization. Since then, a number of relevant documents have been published, most recently in October 2020, Pope Francis' encyclical Fratelli Tutti. All these documents together form the body of Catholic social teaching, and they discuss many social concerns. And they do this on the basis of key principles that Professor Graf has mentioned, such as the principle of the dignity of the human person, the principle of the common good, the principle of solidarity, or the principle of the preferential option for the poor. These principles are quite abstract, and the sound of them is not always very catchy. Pope Francis once commented that there's a danger that they become mere generalities that do not challenge anyone. So these principles have to be translated so that they can be relevant, so that they can be a thorn in the flesh. As an Austrian, please allow me to quote Franz Kafka here. He once observed, "A book must be the X for the frozen sea inside us." Isn't it a beautiful quotation? A book must be the X for the frozen sea inside us. Similarly, the principles and ideas of Catholic social teaching must be the X for the frozen sea inside us. We went through all the key documents and collected the relevant material, and quite in a while we felt challenged when we consulted the documents. We were interested in the question, what do the CST documents say about the just wage, either directly or indirectly? There are actually many passages in Catholic social teaching documents since 1891 that talk about the just wage explicitly, since this very question was featured in the very first social encyclical. To give you just one example, the highest ranked document with an explicit reference to just wage is the Second Vatican Council document, Gaudium et Spes. In section 67, we read, "Remuneration for labor is to be such that man may be furnished the means to cultivate worthily his own material, social, cultural, and spiritual life, and that of his dependents, in view of the function and productiveness of each one, the conditions of the factory or workshop, and the common good." End of quote. Famous. Gaudium et Spes 67, you may all know this by heart. I read it again, nonetheless. "Remuneration for labor is to be such that man may be furnished the means to cultivate worthily his own material, social, cultural, and spiritual life, and that of his dependents, in view of the function and productiveness of each one, the conditions of the factory or workshop, and the common good." End of quote. What we see here are important references to a decent life and to the common good and to the context of work. But we also see here a non-gender just language that expresses a particular way of thinking about the family wage model with the male breadwinner who should be able to feed his family. That is why there was a need for discussion in our working group, and there were many discussions in our interdisciplinary group. So, where does the just wage framework come from? It comes from a careful reading of important Catholic soul teaching documents and many discussions after that. However, last sentence, the answer can be even simpler. The just wage framework is based on concerns expressed in the Gospels. We read in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verse 7, the laborer deserves to be paid. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Clemens. Now I'll briefly introduce everyone to our Just Wage Framework, an online tool, though I encourage you to visit the website, which I've had posted here, even though I messed it up a little bit, and engage it more deeply on your own. Starting from, but expanding beyond core CST principles, as Professor Sedmak said, the Just Wage Working Group gathered folks from across a variety of academic disciplines and departments: history, economics, philosophy, theology, sociology, management, social work, the law. And we came up with a Just Wage Framework containing 7 interconnected criteria that together, we think, collaborate to promote workplace justice. 1, a just wage promotes a decent life. 2, it promotes asset building. 3, it provides social security. 4, it forbids discrimination while fostering inclusion. 5, it mitigates excessiveness. 6, it reflects participation by workers. And 7, it accounts for performance and qualification. Along with the framework itself, we created an interactive, online, just wage tool to encourage multiple stakeholders to discern values and priorities, measure actual workplace scenarios, and to learn more. This just wage tool, you see one of the examples here on the page, guides the user through each criterion one by one, asking how much the user agrees or disagrees with a set of statements that serve as indicators for that particular criterion. Bundling those answers, a results page reveals, via a color-shaded honeycomb of hexagons, how much the wage scenario the person has entered is approaching justice. And because we're at Notre Dame, more gold equals more just. The results page also suggests to the user which criteria she might want to learn more about, pointing to resource pages that provide starting points to the following 4 questions. What does CST say? What is the law? What does research show? And who does it well? We're still building and improving these resource pages, but the website also already provides a plethora of information and links to other useful websites. So we hope you'll try it out and let us know what you think. We think this Just Wage Framework and tool can make a meaningful contribution to discussions and debates about wages and work. Why? Well, here's 3 reasons. First, the Just Wage Framework emphasizes the interconnectedness of the 7 criteria, arguing that they are all important and all necessary to collaborate to promote justice at work. We don't rank the criteria, saying one is more foundational than the other. We want people to see the links connecting the different criteria rather than lines separating them. Second, our Just Wage tool is holistic and qualitative in the name of promoting discernment and dialogue. It does not produce a particular dollar figure or point total. A just wage, as we see it, is more complex and robust than a minimum wage or a living wage focusing strictly on dollars per hour. That isn't a knock on campaigns such as the Fight for 15 or tools like MIT's Living Wage Calculator. Our approach aims to build upon those by expanding and deepening the wage conversation. And that includes thinking not just about minimums, not just about floors, but also about ceilings, maximums. A third quick reason why we think the just wage tool is useful and unique. It's designed for use by multiple stakeholders, including entrepreneurs, employers, labor leaders, community groups, and policymakers. And when I say multiple stakeholders, I mean Catholic and non-Catholic alike. We began with CST because we're at a Catholic institution, and it provides us with a vocabulary for engaging these questions in a moral sense. But the principles of CST related to work and the economy are neither unique nor unfamiliar to those from other faith or secular traditions. Rather, they're common sense notions that too often get dropped in economic discussions. Our point is to employ a moral lens to reframe foundational questions in order to generate more productive answers in the cause of a more just economy. That's what we aim to do here with the Just Wage Framework and Tool. And now I'll turn to my good friend and colleague, Charles Hurst, assistant professor in the management department at Notre Dame's Mendoza College of Business, who will talk a bit more about why we think the Just Wage Framework matters. Charles, are you there?
I'm here. You see me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for being here, everyone. Thank you, Dan and Clemens. Dan asked me to talk about why the Just Wage Framework is unique and worthy of a forum. And I think I'm going to repeat some of his points here, but also go into a little more detail about why the Just Wage Framework is unique. So as many of you are probably aware, the Biden administration is proposing a federal minimum wage increase to $15, which is an ambitious goal when you consider the current minimum is $7.25. And you're probably also aware that some cities like Seattle have already raised their minimum wage to $15. And in fact, Seattle's minimum wage is now going up to $16.69, I believe. And then there's living wage advocacy, which is more ambitious than minimum wage advocacy in that it takes into account geographic differences in cost of living. And the aims of living wage advocacy are still fairly modest in the sense that the living wage is based only on the bare essentials individuals and families need. It's a subsistence wage. But even next to this very basic standard, the minimum wage of $15 looks inadequate in some places. According to MIT's living wage calculator, a family with 2 adults and 2 children in childcare in King County, where Seattle is located, needs an hourly wage of $19 for each adult. That's a living wage. And even in a fairly low cost of living county like St. Joseph, which is where Notre Dame is, $15 slightly misses the mark as a living wage, which would be $15.33 for each of the 2 adults in a household with 2 kids in childcare. And so beyond the minimum wage and the living wage, there's the United Way's ALICE framework. ALICE stands for asset limited income constrained. So not enough money and few assets, houses, cars, retirement funds, things like that. So the ALICE framework includes 2 types of budgets, the household survival budget and a household stability budget. The survival budget is comparable to the living wage, except that it also makes more room for saving for contingencies. The stability budget goes a step further, providing estimates of what people need to earn in order to be able to do things like save for retirement, pay for education, buy a home, and so forth. Kind of the basic things that we all, people in this quote unquote room, expect from our compensation. It's not lavish. But the stability wage for 2 adults with 2 kids in childcare in St. Joseph County is $24, which is $9 higher than what the living wage calculator says is the living wage in St. Joseph. So already there's quite a difference between the survival wage and the living wage. The stability wage for 2 adults with 2 kids in childcare in St. Joseph County is that's $24, which is $9 more than the living wage. And by the way, the stability wage in King County, where again Seattle is located, is $5 more than the living wage that's been calculated there. So it's, I believe, I'm not sure. It's $5 more than what the living wage is there. So it's notable that since the $15 minimum wage was instituted in Seattle in 2014, the number of families that are, in United Way's terminology, asset limited and income constrained has actually risen by 45%. And the number of those in poverty is not markedly decreased. So $15 is a lot politically, but not necessarily enough in terms of human need. So one thing the minimum wage, the living wage, and the United Way budgets have in common with the just wage framework is that they prioritize the poor. One thing that is unique about the just wage framework, as Dan said, is that it covers more than monetary compensation, which all human resource practitioners know compensation is about more than pay. It's about the full suite of benefits.
Have we lost Charles?
I'm afraid, yes.
Well, she had had an emergency that meant she had to do that in her car, so it might be she's having internet connectivity problems. So perhaps at this point, we should move on. I'm sorry that Charles's presentation got cut off, but thanks to her for her contribution. Now we'll turn to a just wage expert who's not part of our Notre Dame community. Don Stabile is a professor of economics at St. Mary's College of Maryland and the author of at least a dozen books, I stopped counting, including The Living Wage, Lessons from the History of Economic Thought, The Political Economy of a Living Wage, Progressives, the New Deal, and Social Justice, and Macroeconomic Policy in a Living Wage, the Employment Act as Redistributive Economics, 1944 to 1969. One of the world's leading experts on the history and concept of the living wage, Professor Stabile has studied our just wage framework and will offer his initial thoughts now. Professor Stabile.
Well, thank you, Dan. I want to say it's great to be here all this time, and I'm actually honored to be part of this group. I'm going to make just a couple of introductory remarks, and then I'm going to go kind of through each of the criteria and talk about the issues that were raised by it. So the first thing I want to say is my last two books, The Political Economy of the Political, they both focused on President Franklin Roosevelt's Economic Bill of Rights, often referred to as his second Bill of Rights, which he set forth in the State of the Union speech in 1944. And what he tried to do with this Bill of Rights was to give a pretty comprehensive statement of what was needed for a living wage. My first book talks about how the background of all this led up to a living wage, led up to the Bill of Rights. And the second book is to follow through and how this Economic Bill of Rights was influential through the 1960s. Just to give one example, when he accepted the nomination for the Democratic Party, President John F. Kennedy said, "We want Roosevelt's Economic Bill of Rights." That was part of our platform. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over the Economic Bill of Rights because I think I'll spend too much time on them, but they're worth Googling and looking them up. And if I have time laterwards, I'll read them out for you. What I do want to say is when I started looking at the 7 criteria for just wage, I said, wow, this is an awful lot like Roosevelt's Economic Bill of Rights, only better. And it's better in the sense that it's much more comprehensive. What the Roosevelt Bill of Rights does is, if we look on the screen here, on the left side, we see these 7 small blurbs. That's what the Roosevelt Bill of Rights looks like. But what the framework here does is when you click on each one, you get a paragraph that gives you a lot more depth and detail about it. And so in that sense, I think it is a much more thorough approach than the Economic Bill of Rights that Roosevelt set forth back in 1944. And it's probably the first such statement of something similar to that since Roosevelt did it. So I tip my hat to everyone at the Higgins Labor Center. So starting off now, criteria number one, basically the wage enables a decent life for workers and households. And the first issue I'll raise is, well, just what do we mean by decency to begin with? And my starting point here in the history of economic thought is going to be with Adam Smith. Some might be surprised that the apostle of free markets had something to say about a living wage and a just wage. But I did some research on this, and I found that looking at a lot of sources, there's a direct link from Thomas Aquinas and his concept of just wages and just prices, all the way to Adam Smith, who talked about the natural wage and the natural prices. And so what Smith said is, when we define the natural wage, and this is a quote, a man must always live by his work, and his wages must at least be sufficient to maintain him. They must even upon most occasions be somewhat more, otherwise it would be impossible for him to bring up a family, and the race of such workmen would not last beyond the first generation. Well, that's kind of the subsistence element that we were talking about earlier, sort of like a minimum wage. But Smith went on and said that this natural wage includes not only the commodities which are indispensably necessary for support of life, but whatever the custom of the country renders it indecent for creditable people, even of the lowest order, to be without. So there's what we would call a social element to the living wage as well, that people have to have the dignity of feeling that they're decent, reputable members of society. This was Adam Smith's view of it. And what Smith then gave some examples, he said, well, in England, for example, to be decent, you have to have linen shirts and leather shoes as part of your commodities. Whereas in Scotland, I find this hard to believe, but women, it was okay to be barefoot if you're a woman and still be considered a decent, dignified human being. But the point here is that there's a basket of goods and services that enables workers to live, but also have a decent life. But it varies from place to place, not simply because of the cost of living, but because of community standards, if you will. Well, in addition to being able to trace Smith back to St. Thomas Aquinas, we can go forward and see that he was influential throughout the 19th and into the 20th century with this. A lot of economists following Adam Smith in the early part of the 19th century just accepted the subsistence wage part of it. And in a lot of debates that took place in England over trying to reform the poor laws that existed in a way that would help the agricultural workers who had been enclosed off of common lands and industrial workers who were working in factories, economists pretty much said, well, subsistence is about all that they can get. But the advocates for reforming the poor laws, such as Richard Comden and William Taylor Coleridge, actually used the term living wage, saying that, no, we need to allow these workers to have a living wage. And they started, following Smith, coming up with budgets that they thought would be reasonable for that. Well, the next famous economist along the line who discussed this and added to it was Karl Marx, who basically almost plagiarized Smith's definition when he talked about subsistence needs. But then he added that the decency element that Smith talked about was a product of history and depends therefore to a great extent on the level of civilization attained by a country. So not only does the idea of what constitutes decency or a decent life depend on where you are. It depends on what stage of history you're involved in. So this is one of the kind of issues that we always confront. I mean, I'll often talk to my students about this, and I'll say, "Well, so what do you think? Decent living? Does it include a smartphone?" They will go, "Yeah, it's got to have a smartphone to be considered decent." And they'll come up with other things. Well, the kind of Smith definition continued in the US. The first proponent of it was an economist named Richard T. Ely, who was the founder of what's called the Wisconsin School, that took a broad perspective on economics and came up with a lot of the reforms that took place. And he also, and he had very similar definition to what Adam Smith said, that yes, we've got to maintain a worker and his family, but we also have to give them recreation, relaxation, maybe some education. And so he also kind of gave a sort of vague definition of it. Well, Ely is especially important because he was a very big influence on Monsignor John Augustine Ryan, who in 1906 wrote a book called The Living Wage, which was very influential for the next 25 years. And Richard T. Ely was very influential, one, because Ryan studied his works and they formed an important part of his thinking. Ryan also, of course, was rooted in Catholic social teaching. And one of his kind of obscure influences, I don't know, Dan, if this comes up, was a Father Matteo Liberatore, who was an Italian priest who also wrote a lot about economics and the need for a just wage. But Ryan thought that a decent livelihood had to meet the needs of existence marked by the dignity of a human being, which meant enough to raise a family by providing the worker and the family with food, clothing, and shelter, for both the worker and the family, at least until the offspring were able to work, allow them to save enough to guard against illness, accidents, and the infirmity of age, to give his family a modest amount of education, entertainment, and the ability to perform religious obligations. So again, that's a pretty broad statement. And the issue is, how do we make it more practical? The previous speaker talked about some of the things. The MIT living wage calculator tries to do this. Well, this was something that concerned economists in the 1920s. And one economist I'll mention was Paul H. Douglas. Probably people of my generation remember Paul Douglas as a senator from Illinois, a very liberal senator from 1949 to 1967. Before that, he was a well-known economist. He contributed something called the Cobb-Douglas production function, which economists still use today. And in it, he was trying to answer the question of whether wages really were based on productivity, the way market economists usually say it is. Well, in 1920, he wrote an article on how can we define a living wage? And he based his argument on a study that was done by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in 1919, which came up with 4 different standards of income, which they referred to as poverty, subsistence plus, and comfort. And they actually had income ranges based on different surveys they took in cities to do this. Well, Douglas says, well, yeah, poverty, no, that's no good. We can't do that as a living wage. Comfort, well, that might be a little too much because then people won't have any incentives to improve themselves. But if we limit them just to subsistence, well, they might stint on their basic needs to buy some of the things that will make them appear to have a decent livelihood. So that's why Douglas thought of the subsistence plus as the proper level. But this brings up a second issue, which is if we do have a living wage budget, is it descriptive or is it prescriptive? And here we can go back to explain what I mean. Is John Stuart Mill, another well-known economist, didn't like the idea of a living wage, but he talked about a wage that allowed for productive consumption. And by that, he meant that workers would add enough money to consume enough so they could maintain their productivity and the productivity of their children. Another economist who had the same thought is Thorstein Veblen, who developed the idea of conspicuous consumption. That is, people who are showing off how well off they are by displaying their consumption, as a distinction between what Mill would call productive consumption. And Veblen worried that workers too would stint on their basic needs in order to keep up appearances of having conspicuous consumption. John Ryan, as another example, felt that workers had an obligation to refrain from alcoholic beverages. They had to be sober as part of it. So the question comes down to is, do workers have an obligation to spend a living wage productively? A third issue, again touched on previously, was should there be an individual or a household living wage? Well, here again, Paul Douglas chimed in and said, well, living wage advocates are basing their idea of a living wage on there being a family of 5. Well, Douglas crunched the numbers and said, no, a family of 5, if we give everybody that much of a living wage, GDP isn't big enough for it. And at the same time, it's also too generous for a single individual. So if we set a family living wage, then individuals who aren't married and have no family are going to get a lot more pay. If we, and he was writing at a time where most families had a kind of male household worker and the rest of the family didn't work. So Douglas's approach was to provide the subsistence plus wage for persons who were married but didn't have children. And this would be a little bit more for single workers, but that would help them save for the time when either they were going to marry or when they wanted to retire. And then for families with children, he thought that there should be welfare for them, that instead of putting their children into a wage package, that the government, or in those days, other charitable organizations could take care of them. Another issue raised in criteria 1 is the idea of the number of hours you need to work to earn your just wage should not be excessive. And so that's how many hours are needed to earn a living wage. Well, again, Douglas thought that for workers, you had to give them a weekly pay rate as a just wage. That if you did it on an hourly basis and they didn't work full time, they wouldn't get the proper wage. So you could set a living wage at $15 an hour, as we've talked about, or even $30 an hour. But if the worker only works 12 hours a week, they're not going to have a living wage. So Douglas favored, instead of setting an hourly wage like that, we should set it as a weekly wage. How do we take care of times when workers aren't working? Well, Douglas thought that was just too complicated to include enough in a living wage so workers could save for times when not working, because there were just so much variation from unemployment, sickness, a variety of accidents. And so he suggested unemployment insurance for periods when workers weren't working. So, and this developed, I'll add, into kind of the New Deal approach. And John Ryan sort of thought of this as well, is that one way to get a living wage was to combine a minimum wage with social insurance. That is, you have a minimum wage, but you also have Social Security, pensions, unemployment insurance, and health insurance. So for him, that was a whole package. And that was kind of the goal of the New Deal, which they didn't completely get. Another element in this, in the 1940s, around 1945, both the CIO and the AFL, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the American Federation of Labor, the main organization of unions, started promoting what they call a guaranteed annual wage, where they said workers should get at least a minimum wage the year around. And they said, well, why not? Well, why? After all, management gets an annual wage. You know, they're not paid on an hourly basis or even a weekly basis. You know, most incomes that we get sort of, here's your annual pay. So why shouldn't workers have that same amount limit? So that's kind of another issue, is that, well, why can't we just fix a living wage, a just wage, whatever, at a decent level and guarantee it for the whole year? Another issue which John Ryan observed is, how does a living wage account for a dynamic economy with changing technology, global trade, and inflation? Things can change all the time. You know, you're working in a typewriter factory one day, and the next day you got computers taking over. I don't know. Last year I was going to be standing up with a bunch of PowerPoint slides explaining this. Now I'm doing it by something called Zoom, which I never heard of a year ago. The economy is always changing, and it's due to changing technology, in our days, especially global trade and inflation. So one issue that Ryan said is that to take into account changing technology and global trade, we can guarantee a living wage, but we can't guarantee that you're going to get to keep a specific job. So the idea is that every job in the economy should carry a living wage. And if you're in an industry that technology, for some reason, just destroys your industry, then when you look for another job, you're going to find one at a living wage. He also thought there should be annual cost of living adjustments in wages as part of this. So a living wage should be indexed to inflation, as we would call it now. And to give an example where this has been missing is in the minimum wage, because adjusted for inflation, the minimum wage reached its peak in about 1968. And then because of inflation afterwards, and the fact that the increases have lagged behind inflation, it's fallen way behind inflation. And I once did the calculation, if we took the minimum wage of 1968, which I think was about $1.65 or something, and adjusted for inflation, it would now be $15 an hour. So in a sense, then the efforts to raise a minimum wage, the national federal minimum wage, to $15 an hour, are simply returning to where it was in 1968. So that's an important element to think about too, is how do we manage to keep the living wage, the just wage, whatever, in line with inflation in the economy. Okay, now I'll shift to criteria 2, where the wage enables asset building. Well, here too, I'll start out by saying, one, there's a little bit of a prescriptiveness in this too, because suppose recipients of the living wage don't want to build their assets. They want to spend all their money now on things they want. Are we necessarily, do they have an obligation, if there is a living wage, to give them, to require them to build assets? Well, the approach in the US has sort of been yes, because the issue then is, should Social Security pensions be counted as savings and as an asset? And here in the history of economic thought, a fairly obscure person named Barbara Nice-Tribe Armstrong, who in 1932 wrote a book called Insuring the Essentials, Social Insurance plus a Minimum Wage equals a Living Wage. And so she was pushing for especially Social Security and unemployment insurance. She's somewhat obscure. She had a PhD in economics and a law degree. But when President Roosevelt sent out something called the Committee on Economic Security to kind of draft a Social Security Act, the person in charge was named Edwin Whitty, who's often referred to as the father of Social Security. He was a student of Richard T. Ely, just to know this is all in the same family. But Barbara Armstrong was kind of like second in command, and her biographer says she was kind of the brains behind all that took place. Well, for her, that as part of a living wage, the government set up this national system of pensions and unemployment insurance where workers contributed to their benefits to give them the dignity of paying their own way. So it was, as I'll talk about in a minute, kind of like forcing workers to save and contribute to a pension for themselves. Do we want to count that as part of this asset building obligation, or as I say, should Social Security pensions be counted as savings? Well, my students don't think so because they don't think it's going to be there for them. But what Social Security did in the pension plan, as we're all probably familiar when you see your paycheck, it's based on something called a payroll tax. And the payroll tax, it started out at 1% of the payroll of your pay plus 1% from your employer. And the idea was phased into 3% by 1946. Since then, it's gone up to 6.2% of your pay plus 6.2% of your pay by the employer. So the question is, would workers be better off with a living wage in their own savings that they would then set aside and put into, I don't know, a 401k? I mean, I'm sort of familiar with that because yes, I have my TA CREF account. And then what are they going to do with it? Will they put it into a home, which is what most people do? Or are they going to put it into some kind of stock market account, put it into CDs in a bank? Investment can be somewhat risky. And so again, that's just another one of the issues of how should we count Social Security?
All right, Don, so we got about 4 minutes or so.
Okay, so then I'll just kind of finish up with criteria 3, the wage provides basic security for workers and households. And this again is the same question about Social Security. Should economic security be provided by the government? And should it be based on contributions or based on need? And when the Social Security Act was prepared by the Community of Economic Security and under the influence of Roosevelt and followed by the Congress, it had to be based on contributions. So your Social Security benefits you get, I'm learning all about this now, are based on how much money you paid into Social Security. So if you have a high pay and you get higher benefits than if you have a low pay. Well, when the Social Security Act was being put in place in the 1930s, I have a good quote from Abraham Epstein, who was a real expert on pensions, but he was left off the Committee of Economic Security. His biographer says, because everybody thought he was kind of difficult, which meant that he had really strong views. And his view was in Social Security insurance, it does not matter whether the people bearing the risk pay contributions themselves. Those who suffer most should not be made to bear the heaviest burden. Relief should be given as a matter of right in a dignified manner. And this was something Paul Douglas actually expressed the same view. And at the time, the New Republic also supported this view that yes, we shouldn't be basing the economic security that workers get, we shouldn't be basing it on their income, but should be basing it on how much they actually need in order to survive. So that then should, my final question then is, should economic security be based on need and paid for by general taxes? And that also raises the question about, what about the idea of universal basic income, which has been floating around right now? Just last week, I read there's this perspective in economics now called modern monetary theory. And the author is Stephanie Kelton has proposed that we should just give everybody a guaranteed job. And if they lose their job for whatever reason, the government will just hire them. And so, and pay them at a living wage. So do we provide security through the government? So is government a supplement to the just wage, or do we want the just wage to cover everything so people don't have to lie about the government? And I'll leave it there.
All right, Don, thanks so much for taking us through that history of ideas on and debates about the minimum, the living, the just, the natural, all sorts of different descriptions of wages. So I want to thank you for that. And it's great that you ended with a question. So maybe we should entertain that. I mean, I'll start and certainly encourage my colleagues to weigh in on this as well, and ask them if they want to chime in to please unmute themselves and show their camera. But the just wage framework, we decided that most people still make their living by working for someone else, even with the erosion of the traditional good paying job, you might say, and the assaults on that, the notion of a career through a job. Most people still work for someone else. And so the just wage framework is meant to be understood by folks who work for a living. At the same time, it's not meant simply to characterize the relationship solely between employer and employee. So the notion is, and that's why Social Security is in there. There's certainly a role in our just wage understanding that the community at large through government is responsible and responsive to making sure that wages are just. And surely the US case is such an extreme one in terms of putting so much of a person's livelihood into what job they hold. And the whole history of those excluded from benefits, those in collective bargaining agreements that gain those. So we're working on the framework to try to make sure that there's an understanding that the state has a prominent function. Of course, people will disagree on what function and what role that is, how central it is, and the like. So I don't know if others want to weigh in on that. Anybody else, as we're gearing up now for the Q&As, and I encourage people to please submit questions while we're moving into the discussion phase. We've got a great 15 minutes left.
Dan?
Yes,
Yeah, this is Charlotte.
Carlos is back. Thank you, Professor. Burke.
Yeah, sorry everyone. I was at a rest stop and lost my reception, but I was listening with great interest to Don, I think, our last speaker, and this idea of whether we calculate the wage based on people's need. And one of the points that I was going to make earlier that I think makes the just wage framework unique is that in these other discussions about wages, there's really very little discussion about how gender and race intersect with that. And I think that's relevant to how you would determine need. So I wonder if we're discussing need, who would be the exemplar? Like, whose needs would we base the wage on? Because if you look at, like, you raised the point about, well, if we pay people more enough to save for retirement, would they? If you're looking at Black families, maybe not, because maybe most likely, very likely, they'll need to also help provide for their parents. They are less likely to have generational wealth. They may invest the money in a home, whereas people who have more wealth may have, have inherited a home. You have female dominated fields where even if you raise the minimum wage to $15, you may still have unequal pay based on gender discrimination. So that just made me think about, like, how would you assess need? Whose needs would you assess it on? And I always kind of think of it, I feel like the typical, what people have in mind is like a man who's blue collar, supporting a family. And we're so much more diverse than that.
I think that's a really important point, Charles. This is Thea Lee from the Economic Policy Institute. And I think one of I think this is a really interesting project, and it's very timely and very relevant. So thanks to the presenters for that, the context and the history and the framing. One of the things that I think is important when you approach this is pushing back against the narrative of the last couple of decades that there somehow is an equilibrium correct wage that the market will deliver. And I think Charles's point about the racial discrimination and gender discrimination and historical accumulation of unfairness is built into our wage system. And it's built into not just people's accumulated wealth, but also how they enter the labor market, whether they, what kind of education, whether it's been a segregated education or a private school or tutors and so on and so forth. And so, all of those things, how people enter the labor market and what kind of bargaining power they bring to the table, I think is important. And, so when we see this issue of what the government role is, I think it's important for us to note that the government has put a finger on the scale against working people for a couple of decades in a lot of different ways, by allowing the value of the minimum wage to erode for the last 50 years, by supporting politicians that wanted to bust unions and erode bargaining power, by letting employers get away with a lot of different ways of preventing workers from competing fairly, like forced arbitration clauses or other kinds of things. So when you look at that weight of all the unfairness against working people, then it's important to see what we need to do now as trying to help workers rebuild their bargaining power so that the wage can more reflect both their needs, but also what's fair, and to understand that the market outcome is not necessarily the only outcome or the most fair one.
Thanks so much, Thea. And I remind people, Thea will be a featured speaker on February 26th at our next session. I see Will's hand up. Will you introduce yourself? And then we'll go to a couple of the questions from the Q&A.
Hi, I'm Will McMahon. I'm a labor union organizer with a group of healthcare worker unions in the Northeast. Former student worker of the Higgins Labor Program. I kind of wanted to go off of what Professor Hurst was saying about wage inequities around racial and gender lines, and kind of how it relates to what I saw as kind of a significant red flag in the just wage format as presented, which was this idea that a just wage takes into account performance, which is a kind of somewhat nebulous assessment in practice. You know, what we see, my job is to go to unorganized workplaces and help workers organize unions and fight against unfair conditions. And invariably, they always have what they describe as merit pay or performance-based pay. And they're, you know, I'm sorry, one of my dogs is crying. 1 second. Sorry. What we you know, they invariably have. Sorry, my fiance is gonna go take care of her. A system of what they purport to be paying workers, whether lower wage workers like, you know, housekeeping, or higher wage like nurses, according to their performance. And sometimes they've devised these standards on their own, and other times they've paid for very expensive consultants to do it for them. And so they can take a lot of different forms, but what they invariably lead to is favoritism and very subjective setting of wage rates. And what we've also seen, you know, nursing is about 85%, 85 to 90% women. And in a lot of the urban areas in which I organize, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, there are, you know, large Black communities, large Filipino communities among the nursing population. And when we are, you know, successfully organized and we get all the wage data, and, you know, the bargaining teams are assembling to negotiate kind of wage scales that are based on experience, not, you know, what your manager thinks of your performance, we run numbers, and there are always the exact gaps you would expect on race and on gender. And it doesn't seem to change very much depending on the racial or gender makeup of the managers. And, you know, invariably, even for those who, you know, might be men or might be white, and, you know, so don't break that way due to those reasons, their wages are always lower than they would be with kind of experience-based consistent wage scale. So I guess my kind of question for the group would be, how do you conceive of performance, one, being assessed objectively in any way that doesn't just end up being favoritism, and two, to what extent, if any, should, say, the quality of a child's life during their upbringing be dependent on some nebulous idea of a parent's performance at their job? And, you know, why would that child, say, be less deserving of a good life growing up? And what are the factors that should be taken into account in that assessment?
Good question, Will. If somebody, anybody in the group want to respond to Will's point? I mean, this tricky thing about performance and qualification, which is an interesting one in the just wage framework.
Dan.
Yeah, Charlotte, go ahead.
I'll speak to that a little bit. And we talk a lot about performance in my field, and I see what he means about the dangers of performance-based pay, and absolutely agrees. These subjective systems of assessing people are problematic. At the same time, there's so much that people can contribute that is not tangible and not measurable. Like, for instance, mention hospitals. In surgical procedures, you know, nurses who are able to communicate well enable there to be fewer errors in surgery. people of color who enter a predominantly white workplace bring perspectives, and research has shown they bring perspectives and create a dynamic or engender a dynamic that then enables teams to make better decisions. So, I wouldn't want to lose that. I think one part of the answer is that managers have to be trained not to be biased, and you have to codify these skills as much as possible. And there are ways of doing that, but there's a big disconnect between practice and research, especially in that most companies right now pursue diversity training that focuses on implicit bias and thinking if you teach people that they may have bias, then they'll stop being biased, and that simply doesn't work. But I think drawing on the research and what we know to be best practices could help to alleviate that problem of subjective performance standards being unfair.
Thanks, Charles. I want to make sure we get to a couple of the questions on Q&A, and time is flying. But Justice Gormley had asked a couple of questions. One is about how we think about the wage and whether it's simply monetary compensation or something broader. He goes on to ask about ownership of company, gaining the fruit of labor through property acquisition, a sense of meaning and fulfillment. These are all important questions. So I'm curious if folks have thoughts on the non-monetary component of a just wage. The dignity, the sort of sense of satisfaction, the notion of a decent work that includes not just sane scheduling and decent pay and decent treatment, but also ability to contribute.
I mean, that's part of this idea that there are so many non-material dimensions in the person's life. And when you look at studies about job satisfaction, there is pay as an important element, but also something like work climate, especially recognition, where recognition comes in different forms, not only material, but also social and symbolic. Also the purposefulness of work. Is the work meaningful? Do you have different types of work? So is there a variety? And then as Dan said, it's not just decent treatment and decent pay. It's also all these soft factors, which sometimes could be called the intangible infrastructure of the workplace, which has a deep value dimension to it. Which brings me to Don's point about the prescriptive element in our just wage framework. And this will never go away. In Catholic social teaching, you have this very strong prescriptive element. We expect persons to live a frugal life, to save, to be moderate and modest. And we may be a little careful with not respecting pluralistic life choices, which is one of the homeworks we still have to do.
I mean, another point I would make is that, and this is one of our attendees made reference to it in the Q&A about how union representation can be critical in fighting wage discrimination. And, a voice at work through a union contract is not historically or ever perfect, but it is a good starting point for trying to negotiate over and answer many of these questions, monetary and non-monetary. So the notion that workers know what they want, and if given a chance to negotiate over those things, they might, we tend, our discussions about what's a good job are solely about how much money one makes, it seems. It's a good job if it pays well. And that there's a lot of stuff that's not factored into that having a voice at work to determine some of the conditions as well as contributions and negotiate over those would be great. So Dawn Schumann of Teamster Local 104 in Arizona, thanks for your point there. Others, I know we're already at 2:15 and, mostly that's because of my botched technology at the beginning. If people can stay on and want to stay on for a little while longer, great. I understand if people have to go. But Clemens, do we have other questions on there?
I fed you all the ones I saw.
Okay.
So the very first question, did you see that? If the living wage of
Go ahead.
If the living wage of $15 per hour will still keep a family of 4 on our federal free and reduced lunch program, K-12, is it considered a just wage? Should a just wage take an individual or family off any federal support altogether?
To me, that means what you determine as federal support in our means-tested system. Anybody want to answer that from their point of view?
I mean, just one little remark from my side. We keep discussing the different agents involved in the constitution of a just wage. It's not only the employer, it's also the states and the frameworks that are provided by the state. Coming from Austria, we have a different welfare state model where you don't expect the employer to be solely responsible for the just wage. And I think we have to look into the full package with obviously a preference for autonomy and the ability for the employee to make choices and to control what he or she wants to do with his or her money.
Thanks, Clemens. Others want to get in on that point or raise another one?
Dan,
Yeah.
I don't want to dominate, but since nobody is speaking up on that, the way I see that, people still being on free and reduced lunch and food stamps, even though, as Clemens said, companies, it's not all on companies. Many companies are doing a lot less than they could, and taxpayers are subsidizing what should be compensation coming from the employer. And in that sense, the just wage framework is more comprehensive because it's kind of a vision, in my view, of a just society in which people are not subsidizing, taxpayers are not subsidizing companies that are actually able to compensate better. And, is my wage just if I'm being taxed in order to pay for social programs that, because my employer won't compensate people well, and similar, other large size employers won't compensate people well. So
this whole question of the social wage, what is the common wage provided to all through the state, whether that's public parks, a floor on the minimum wage, Social Security and health insurance. John Dacey in the Q&A asked about how does affordable housing and transportation costs, how do those impact or get counted in a just wage? And again, the US has a very low practical tax rate on employers, and therefore a smaller social wage that's paid out in those sorts of common goods. I think most, if not all of us in the just wage framework believe that the social wage in the US should be higher, and then there's less pressure on the market wage or the job wage. But we're at 2:20 now, and this just wage conversation is meant to be the first of 9. And so I hope that you'll join us in future ones where I'll sort out the technology better. We'll start on time. Next time, again, is February 26th, 2 weeks from today. After that, it's roughly every 3 Fridays. Everybody on this webinar should be on our list to receive announcements of the future dates. So please keep your email eyes peeled for that. I want to thank very much those for coming in and joining us, but especially my colleagues, Clemens Sedmak and Charles Hurst, and Don Stabile for bringing us his wisdom for studying the living wage and the debates over wages historically for a lifetime. So I want to thank all of you for speaking to us today. And please shoot me an email if you have suggestions on future just wage topics, ways to improve the tool or the framework, or questions about anything. Otherwise, I hope to see you all on Friday, February 26th at 1 p.m. With that, I'll say thanks and have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you,
you,
Don.
Dan.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you all.
Thanks,
Bye-bye
Dan.
now.
Thanks, everyone.